For the young Virginia Woolf, the world changed in 1908 when her friend Lytton Strachey pointed at the stain on her sister's dress and inquired, "Semen?" And Virginia Woolf recalled this event in her book Moments of Being, and she said, "With that one word, all barriers of reticence and reserve went down. Sex permitted our conversation. The word bugger was never far from our lips. We discussed copulation with the same excitement and openness that we had discussed the nature of good. So there was now nothing that one could not say, nothing that one could not do at 46 Gordon Square. It was, I think, a great advance in civilization." So it was apparently a great advance from the era of Victorian moralities that she kind of harasses in that statement. And I think I also tend to use Victorianism in this kind of pejorative sense, that you always say, "You're being so Victorian," or "Oh my goodness, those Victorian morals, they drive me absolutely mad." And since I work quite extensively with American literary history, then of course the influence of the old Puritan ideals have been very persistent in American literary history, where you don't say Victorian perhaps, but you mean pretty much the same thing, this kind of strong sexual restraint and a strict social code of conduct, which is also part of the sort of Puritan ideals. And also the sense of moral contradictions, hypocrisy. In the Victorian era we saw an enormous increase of prostitution and child labor, for example. And we knew, of course, that copulations didn't go down during the Victorian era at all, although you never spoke about it. So when Virginia Woolf could hear the word semen, that was very different from what you could say and speak in the Victorian times. I mean, in the Victorian times you were not even allowed to refer to a leg. You had to call it a limb and not a leg. So yeah, there is this kind of double standards, moral double standards that we tend nowadays, from a modern perspective, relate to the Victorian age. Although of course Victorianism is much more as an era. It includes a lot of development in social welfare and social reforms, and of course big leaps when it comes to scientific developments and findings. The term itself was coined in 1851 at the opening of the Great Exhibition in London by Queen Victoria. I think it's quite convenient to have in British literary history that you have this kind of terms that are defined by the current reign of the country. So of course the ones that ruled England before Queen Victoria was a gang of Georgians, and they definitely did not represent that kind of moral standards that Queen Victoria set on the country. Quite the contrary, the Georgians were very immoral in many senses, and was engaged in a lot of sort of non-moral activities. But the Victorian age, defined by 1837 to 1901, and then successed by what is called the Edwardian age, until 1911, and then we have a new Georgian era, which is generally the era that we see the modernists belonging to. So it's quite conveniently set in a historical time span, which is very different from how we relate it to Romanticism, which was much more a definition of ideas and thoughts and relations to life and aesthetics than Victorianism. Victorianism is very much more about themes and content and subject matter and relationship to the Victorian era as well, because most of the writers of the Victorian era, they have some kind of relationship to what is called Victorian morals. So you either approve of it or you react to it, and of course a lot of authors did react to it in a very you can say a subtle way, of course. When it comes to the Victorian attitude to sexuality, it is quite interesting that it's of course connected to religion. Bigot religiousness and Christianity has always been a dominant sexual authority, and these very old Puritan ideals were forefronted in the Victorian era. But even more so, I think it has to do with very many new economical and social reforms in terms of capitalism and the importance of the domestic space and the role of the family in the economical system. You basically did not want to interrupt the idea of the nuclear family as a sound and important component in a growing capitalist system. And this is of course connected also to the Industrial Revolution, which represents a massive and breathtaking and very successful investment in sort of disciplining the earth and its inhabitants to some kind of human control. And self-discipline is one of those key words in Victorian Puritanism. You shouldn't overdo things, and you should do things in a conformed way in connection to certain kind of moral and social codes that are prevalent. One of the more notorious statements about Victorian sex was made by the physician William Acton. He said that, or he wrote rather, the majority of women are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. One such double morality was of course the idea of prostitution, which was enormous in the Victorian era, and every little village had their amount of prostitutes. Prostitution was, of course, a means for working class women that were not married or did not have anybody to support them to bring in some money, since their work was so enormously poorly paid. The customers were then often the middle classes or the upper classes, where the men, they were supposed to almost go to prostitutes before they got married, since they usually waited 5, 6, 7 years until they got married, whereas the women of those social classes had to get married really early. So it was a practical thing, but it was also, I think, a little bit, if we think about Freud's ideas of repressions, that was a way to live out a sexuality that was not respectable in the domestic spaces. The double standards in terms of prostitution was also that the prostitutes, they were forced to be examined by the Contagious Diseases Act for venereal disease, and they could be quarantined, whereas the men, which was usually military soldiers in the ports, they were not. This changed later on in the 19th century, in the end of the century. Another thing that you usually discuss when you talk about Victorian sexuality is the complete refusal of homosexuality. It was something that you didn't really talk about. Sodomy was actually penalized with death until 1861. Michel Foucault, the French sociologist, usually expresses that the concept of homosexuality as identity was actually born in the 1870s in the Victorian society. But generally in Victorian standards, everything that derived from the norms were always unacceptable in all different kind of ways. So of course women were not subjects, they were pretty much objects in all different kind of sense. If they were prostitutes or married in the upper classes, they still didn't own any money, or they couldn't own their own property, which meant that they were in that sense completely lawless. They were an object either for male sexuality or male dominance in the family, and it was until quite late that they actually got the rights to their own money and their own property. This happened in the end of the Victorian age, and so we can see that a lot of the female Victorian literature and then basically novels show a very kind of critical attitude towards their own role in the British society of the times. So they cannot criticize it, explicitly, but you can read between the lines, and you know what's going on there. There's always some kind of dark, forceful eroticism that is not allowed to develop, but it's always there. And you can see this already in Jane Austen, although she's not technically a Victorian author, but she discusses, for example, that love has to be an important fact in any kind of social relationship, and you shouldn't marry because of money or pride or honor or any kind. You see it definitely in the Bronte sisters. They kind of there's a more mature criticism of the possibilities for the female, and it virtually explodes in the literature of George Eliot. So we can see a trend of more and more explicit criticism towards the Victorian sexuality and Victorian social codes in this era. As I said before, the era of Victorianism is very much more complicated and ambivalent than it might appear at first. I mean, we can, as I said, spot great achievements in women's rights and social reforms. This is also a time when a lot of ideologies are born. It's really the beginning of the isms, as I call them. All these kind of words that end with ism and means is connected to some kind of ideological belief. Of course, we have a huge step taken in science when Charles Darwin publishes The Origin of Species, in 1859, a book that strongly criticized the biblical story of creation, and this created an outrage among a lot of religious circles, of course. And this more scientific approach that develops in the late end of the 19th century is, of course, in many ways a direct contrast to the romantic ideas of irrationality, fantasy, strange concepts of religion, mystic nature. And this leads to a literary realism as well, and the naturalism in the end. Of course, naturalism is not as prominent in Britain as it is in, for example, in America or in France. Yes, you could also say that realism, of course, focuses on different kind of persons. You don't have the same protagonists as you used to have. It's more ordinary people. And yes, the Romantics, they were also interested in the ordinary, but usually the ordinary in a romantic sense was still an outsider or super being or some very exceptional kind of person, even though ordinary there meant rather that they came from the working class or something like that. Whereas in the era of realism, you have a forefronted interest in human beings that are not really wouldn't make the history books, if I might put it like that. You also have, of course, a strong sense of conservatism, which you could say that Victorianism is very strongly linked to conservatism, to a renewal of old traditions and old habits. We see a growth in folklore museums, homecoming days, different kind of celebration days. Something that you still can see in the British society of today, especially if you look into a certain genre of crime films of Britain. You see a recurring theme, which is the kind of nostalgia and the conservatism of old traditions and old cars, old clothes, old clubs, and all these kind of things. Conservatism and the concept of traditions, which in some ways led to ideas of nationalism, is also connected to, of course, the enormously divided Europe after the Napoleon Wars. It's also connected, of course, to imperialism, and nobody would contend that Britain was the #1 imperial country of the 19th century, and they gained an enormous amount of wealth through their imperial states. We have a few other isms like liberalism, which was very closely connected to capitalism, of course, with a free market and a growing middle class. John Stuart Mill, who was a very prominent advocate of liberal ideas, and especially regarding women's rights, created an atmosphere of liberal opinion, which could be seen in an enormous growth of new mass media and press and newspapers. And intellectually, socialism was also an alternative to liberalism, and Karl Marx and Engels published the famous The Communist Manifesto in 1848, which was a groundbreaking view of materialist history. We also see a growth in anarchism, and anarchism you can in a way connect back to the sort of what I talked about in the previous lecture, that there is something individually rebellious about the Romantic era that is not really connected to politics as such, and you can see a link perhaps between that kind of romantic ideal and the growth of anarchism in the 19th century. Finally, I would like to say that since the imperial project of Britain was so enormous, the morals of the Victorian era was spread through huge parts of the world, and thus it was extremely influential, as was its morals of Puritanism and conservatism. That also means that a lot of the literature from this era was spread, and that was in a way the beginning of the growth of English as a literary subject, because you wanted to nationalize the colonies and teach them about English values and morals, and you did this predominantly through British literature. Of course, this imperial project fostered a nationalism that wasn't very sound, as I mentioned before, an unsoundness that we can see expressed in Rudyard Kipling's books, where Joseph Conrad's, for example, Mr. Kurtz in Heart of Darkness seems to be very aware of the dark side of this imperial project. Kipling's exotic fantasies has an almost typical Victorian perspective on hegemony over invaded countries and cultures and people. we can see then in the end of the Victorian period and in the beginning of the Edwardian era, a change, a critical change towards the Victorian period, which is manifested in, for example, especially Joseph Conrad and Henry James. Although Henry James was not an American, he spent most of his time in Europe, and those two are important triggers of ideas of new ways of handling narrative, especially in terms of point of view, and that's something that we will, of course, return to when we talk about modernism. If we look at this painting once more, we can see that they try to bring in the wild, exotic, the garden into the sort of civilized, space of Victorianism, and I think that is quite representative of both the nostalgic urge back into traditions, bring the wilderness back, but in a very civilized way. We don't want to go out into the jungle, but we want to have a little smell of the jungle in our homes. The growth of garden houses and orangeries exploded practically during the Victorian era. So I'm losing my voice, but not my mind, I hope. See you soon. Bye.